Water splashed, a shock of cool against my skin, spreading across the thin summer dress, making it cling in all the wrong places. I gasped, the cold surprising me, and fumbled for a napkin, elbowing the empty glass off the table's edge. "Careful, Sarah," Mark's voice, deep but laced with amusement, cut through the air. My face flushed hot as I looked up, finding him watching me. His eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat, to where the damp fabric molded to my chest, then snapped back to my face. My breath hitched. It was such a small thing, so fleeting, but it left a charged silence hanging between us, thick and unnamed. "Here," he said, grabbing a dish towel from the counter. He held it out, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. "You okay?" "Fine," I said too quickly, my cheeks burning as I pressed the towel to my dress. It was just lunch, casual, just us, nothing out of the ordinary. Mark had moved back to the city after college, crashing in the spare room to save cash while he figured things out. I'd welcomed the company. The apartment had been too quiet for too long. Having someone else here, a warm presence in the kitchen, the faint sound of footsteps overhead, made it feel less like a tomb. But moments like this, these weren't in the plan. Mark leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "You really are a klutz sometimes." I rolled my eyes, trying to shrug off the moment, pretend it meant nothing. "Always have been," I said lightly, but my voice wavered. "Yeah," he said, his tone softer now. "I know." There was something in the way he said it, something that made my heart skip a beat. I looked away, dabbing at the damp spot on my dress, trying to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. Truth was, I hadn't felt this self-conscious in years, not since before his father, David, passed. Back then, I'd been too busy juggling the demands of a blended family, a husband who expected everything to be just so. Now, with no one to answer to, I'd settled into a quiet routine. Simple meals, quiet nights, the occasional glass of wine to keep me company. Mark's return had thrown a wrench in that routine in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was taller now, broader, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. And while I still thought of him as David's kid, the boy I'd helped raise, moments like these made it hard to ignore the man he'd become. "Want me to grab you another dress?" he asked, nodding toward the damp spot, still painfully obvious. "No," I said quickly. "This'll dry in no time." "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, though his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned to pour himself another glass of water. I watched him from the corner of my eye, my heart still racing. It was nothing, I told myself, just an awkward moment. But the way my chest tightened, the way my skin prickled under his gaze, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. The afternoon sunlight, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes of gold across the kitchen floor. I'd thought the lunch incident was behind us, a silly accident to laugh off later. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing plates, my mind kept replaying the way Mark's eyes had lingered. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of water, the familiar comfort of domestic tasks. The apartment, usually so quiet, felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. "Need a hand?" His voice startled me, and I turned to see Mark leaning against the doorway, arms crossed casually. He'd changed into a plain white t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messed from running a hand through it. "I'm fine," I said, a little too quickly. "Just a few dishes." He stepped into the room anyway, rolling up his sleeves as he approached the sink. "I'm here, might as well help," he said with a shrug. Before I could protest, he reached for a dish towel and began drying the plates I handed him. We worked side by side in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of water and the soft clink of dishes the only things breaking the quiet. It felt normal, familiar, like so many moments we'd shared in this kitchen over the years. And yet, I couldn't shake the awareness of his presence, the way his arm brushed against mine as he reached for another plate, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. "You're quieter than usual," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I glanced at him, startled. "Am I?" He nodded, his gaze flicking to me briefly before returning to the plate in his hands. "You've been distracted all day." "I've just got a lot on my mind," I said, turning back to the sink. "Like what?" The question was simple, casual, but it caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just the usual," I said vaguely, hoping he wouldn't press. But Mark wasn't one to let things go. "The usual, huh?" he said, a faint teasing note in his voice. "You're always taking care of everything. Maybe you need someone to take care of you for a change." I froze, the plate in my hand slipping slightly under the water. "Mark, that's not..." I'm serious, he said, his tone softening. You do so much for everyone else. When's the last time you let someone help you? I didn't have an answer for that. He reached over and gently took the plate from my hands, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver up my spine. Let me finish this, he said quietly. For a moment, I wanted to argue, to insist I didn't need help. But the look in his eyes, steady, sincere, made my protest falter. I stepped back, drying my hands on a towel as he turned back to the sink. I watched him work, his movements unhurried, his focus on the task in front of him. It was such a small thing, but the sight of him standing there, sleeves rolled up, water dripping from his hands, it was impossible to ignore how much he'd changed. How's the job hunt going? I asked, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Slow, he admitted. Seems like every listing wants 5 years of experience for an entry-level position. You'll find something, I said, my voice firm. You're smart, capable, it's just a matter of time. Thanks, he said, turning back to the sink. It means a lot, coming from you. There was something in the way he said it, soft, almost hesitant, that made my chest tighten. I turned away, busying myself with wiping down the counter. I mean it, he said, his voice quieter now. You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I paused, my hand stilling on the cloth. Of course, I believe in you, I said softly. I've seen what you're capable of. When I looked at him, he was watching me, his gaze steady and unflinching. The intensity of it made my breath catch, and for a moment I felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us. You've always been there for me, he said, his voice low, even when you didn't have to be. It's what family does, I said, though my voice trembled slightly. Maybe, he said, his lips curving into a faint, almost bittersweet smile. But not everyone does it the way you do. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, and I felt my pulse quicken. I looked away, focusing on the countertop as I tried to steady myself. When the last dish was dried and put away, Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Thanks for letting me help, he said, his tone light but his gaze lingering on me. You didn't exactly give me a choice, I said, forcing a small smile. He grinned, the tension between us easing slightly. Fair enough. As he turned to leave the kitchen, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. But before he stepped through the doorway, he paused, glancing back at me. You should let yourself relax more, he said softly. You deserve it. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen, his words echoing in my mind. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and wondered why something so simple, so small, had left me feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. The afternoon sun was gentle, casting soft golden light over the fire escape balcony. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the potted plants, sending shifting patterns of shadow across the metal floor where I sat with a cold glass of lemonade. The air smelled of city dust and the faint sweetness of the jasmine that climbed the fire escape rungs. Mark had suggested taking a break after we finished cleaning up the kitchen. Let's sit outside for a bit, he'd said, already grabbing a chair and carrying it out to the balcony. I'd agreed, mostly because I couldn't think of a reason not to, though part of me wondered if being alone with him out here was a good idea. He lounged in the chair beside me, his long legs stretched out and crossed at the ankles. He held a glass of iced tea in one hand, condensation trickling down the sides, while the other rested casually on the armrest. His t-shirt clung to his chest in the summer heat, and the sunlight made the hints of red in his dark hair gleam. This is nice, he said after a moment, tilting his head back to look at the sky. It is, I agreed, though my focus was less on the scenery and more on the quiet tension I couldn't seem to shake. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but there was an awareness in the air between us, a weight to every glance, every pause. I told myself I was imagining it, but the flutter in my chest told me otherwise. You used to come out here all the time, Mark said, breaking the silence. I remember you and Dad sitting on this balcony, drinking wine and talking late into the night. The mention of David sent a pang through me, bittersweet and familiar. We did, I said softly. He loved this spot. Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I never understood how he could just sit and stare at the buildings for hours, but now I get it. I glanced at him, surprised. You've changed, I said without thinking. He looked at me, one brow lifting in amusement. How so? You used to be restless, I said, swirling the ice in my glass. Always moving, always doing something. Sitting still wasn't really your thing. Mark chuckled, the sound low and warm. Guess I've had time to think. College will do that to you, especially when you don't have everything figured out. His tone had shifted, growing quieter, more thoughtful. I turned to him, studying his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his brows furrowed slightly as he stared into the distance. You don't have to have everything figured out, I said gently. Life doesn't work that way. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but it feels like I'm supposed to. Like everyone expects me to have some grand plan, and I don't. Whose expectations are you trying to meet? I asked, tilting my head. Mark hesitated, then glanced at me, his gaze steady. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe mine. Or maybe I'm just scared of disappointing people. My heart ached at his honesty, and I reached over without thinking, placing my hand over his. You could never disappoint me, I said softly. His eyes flickered to where our hands touched, and I realized too late what I'd done. I started to pull away, but his fingers closed over mine, holding me there. Thank you, he said, his voice low and warm. For a moment, we stayed like that, the world around us quiet and still. I could feel the heat of his skin, the strength in his grip, and my heart raced in a way I hadn't felt in years. I pulled my hand back, the loss of his touch leaving a strange hollow in its wake. You don't have to figure everything out today, I said, my voice a little unsteady. Mark smiled faintly, but his eyes lingered on me. Neither do you, he said softly. His words hit me harder than I expected, and I looked away, focusing on the city skyline. The truth of it settled heavily in my chest. I'd spent so long trying to keep everything together, trying to be the rock, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone else carry even a little of the weight. We fell into a companionable silence, the kind that felt both soothing and charged. The afternoon stretched on, the golden light shifting as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Eventually, Mark stood, stretching his arms over his head. I should get started on dinner, he said, his tone light. You're cooking? I asked, raising a brow. Don't sound so surprised, he teased. I've picked up a few skills since I burned that frozen pizza in high school. I laughed, the sound easing some of the tension in my chest. Well, I'm looking forward to it, I said, standing and gathering my glass. As we walked back into the apartment, I couldn't help but steal a glance at him, my heart still racing from the moment we'd shared. Whatever this was, whatever was building between us, it was becoming harder to ignore, and part of me didn't want to. The soft strains of piano music filled the living room, wrapping around me like a familiar, haunting melody. I stood at the edge of the room, the dim glow of the floor lamp casting a warm light over Mark as he played. His back was to me, his shoulders relaxed, his hands gliding effortlessly over the keys. I didn't know he still played. The sight of him there lost in the music caught me off guard. It wasn't something he'd done often, at least not since high school, and the unexpectedness of it stirred something deep inside me, a strange mix of nostalgia and tenderness. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should interrupt. But as the melody shifted, softening into something slower, more wistful, I found myself stepping into the room. You've been hiding this talent, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's hand stilled, and he turned slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I didn't know you were listening. It's hard not to, I said, moving closer. You're really good. He chuckled, turning back to the piano. I wouldn't go that far. It's just something I mess around with when I need to clear my head. Well, it's beautiful, I said, settling into the armchair near the piano. Mark glanced at me, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. This was Dad's favorite song, he said quietly. I felt my chest tighten at the mention of David. He used to hum it all the time, I said, my voice soft. Mark nodded, his fingers brushing over the keys. I started learning it for him when I was a kid. Never told him, though. I wanted it to be a surprise. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest. He would have loved that, I said, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable, as though the music had opened a door to something we both carried, but rarely acknowledged. Mark's hands returned to the keys, his movements slower now, more deliberate. The melody began again, soft and steady, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. Do you want to try? He asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the music. My eyes opened, and I blinked at him, startled. Me? He nodded, scooting over slightly on the bench. Come on, it's easy. I laughed softly, shaking my head. I don't think so. I'm terrible at anything that requires coordination. Mark grinned, patting the empty space beside him. I'll help you. Come on. I hesitated, but something in his expression, a quiet, playful determination, made it impossible to say no. With a sigh, I stood and moved to sit beside him, the small bench forcing us closer than I expected. Okay, he said, his tone light. Just follow my lead. He placed my hands on the keys, his fingers brushing against mine as he guided them. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver up my spine, and I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the music instead of the way his leg pressed against mine. See? He said, his voice low and close to my ear. Not so hard. I laughed softly, my fingers fumbling over the keys. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that. You're doing fine, he said, his tone warm. For the next few minutes, he guided me through the melody, his hands occasionally covering mine to correct my movements. The closeness between us was undeniable, each touch, each brush of his arm against mine adding to the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. At one point, he reached over to press a key I'd missed, his hand lingering on mine for just a moment too long. I froze, my breath catching, and when I looked at him, his gaze was already on me. The room felt impossibly still, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. Mark, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. His hand slid away and he straightened, clearing his throat. Sorry, he said, his tone quieter now. I got carried away. It's fine, I said quickly, though my heart was still racing. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I think that's enough music for one night, he said with a faint smile. Yeah, I murmured, standing as well. For a moment, we stood there, the unspoken tension between us almost unbearable. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. I'll clean up here, he said finally, his tone casual. You should get some rest. I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I turned to leave the room. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the soft strains of the piano began again, quieter this time, almost hesitant. I paused, my hand resting on the banister, and let the music wash over me one last time before retreating into the safety of the dark. The apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes late at night when the city outside has gone dark and the only sound is the faint creak of old floorboards beneath careful steps. I hadn't been able to sleep, not after everything that had happened earlier. My mind felt like a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions, each one more confusing than the last. The dim light of the kitchen drew me in like a beacon, and I stepped inside, the cool tile beneath my feet grounding me. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the silence settle around me. But then, as I turned, I nearly dropped the glass. Mark was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. Couldn't sleep either? He asked, his voice low, husky from the late hour. I shook my head, trying to steady my racing heart. No. Me neither, he said, stepping into the room. He was barefoot, wearing just a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly mussed as if he'd been lying awake, tossing and turning. He moved to the counter, leaning against it as he watched me. You've been quiet today, he said softly. I let out a small, humorless laugh, setting the glass down on the counter. You've said that before. That's because it's true, he said, his tone light but probing. What's going on? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark tilted his head, his gaze steady and unrelenting. That's not like you, he said. You always know, or at least you pretend to. His words struck a nerve, and I felt a flush of irritation rise in my chest. Maybe I'm tired of pretending, I snapped, the words escaping before I could stop them. Mark straightened, his brow furrowing. Tired of pretending what? I hesitated, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. The weight of everything I'd been holding back felt unbearable, and for a moment I wanted to tell him. I wanted to let it all out, to stop hiding. But instead, I shook my head, turning away. It doesn't matter, I said quietly. It does to me, he said, his voice firm but gentle. The intensity in his tone made me pause, and I turned back to him, my heart pounding. Mark, He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and suddenly the space between us felt impossibly small. Talk to me, he said softly. Please. I swallowed hard, my chest tight as I met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable that made it impossible to look away. I've been lost, I admitted finally, the words trembling as they left my lips. Ever since David passed, I've been trying to hold everything together, but I don't know who I am anymore. Mark's expression softened, and he took another step closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine on the counter. You don't have to hold it all together, he said quietly. Not by yourself. His touch sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. It's not that simple, I said, my voice breaking. Maybe it is, he said, his thumb tracing a slow circle against the back of my hand. Maybe you've just convinced yourself it's not. I stared at him, my heart racing as his words sank in. There was no judgment in his tone, no pressure, just quiet reassurance, a steady presence that made me feel like I could finally let my guard down. You don't understand, I whispered. Then help me understand, he said, his voice soft but insistent. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged as I struggled to find the words. But before I could speak, Mark's hand moved, his fingers brushing my cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, as if he were waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. Mark, I said softly, my voice trembling. He leaned in slightly, his forehead nearly touching mine. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it, and every nerve in my body felt alive, electrified. But I didn't tell him to stop. Instead, I let out a shaky breath, my eyes fluttering shut as his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away, but I didn't. My hands found his shoulders, gripping tightly as the kiss deepened, the weight of everything we'd been holding back spilling over in a rush of emotion. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths coming fast and uneven, Mark rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice raw. For what? I asked softly, my voice barely audible. For complicating things, he said, for making this harder for you. I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. It's not just you, I said softly. I'm just as responsible. Mark's thumb brushed against my cheek, wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said. I needed you to know how I feel. His words left me breathless, and I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The quiet between us was thick with unspoken words, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The next evening, the tension between us was almost unbearable. The apartment felt too small, every shared glance too loaded, every moment alone too charged. I'd spent the day trying to keep busy, cleaning, organizing, anything to avoid the weight of Mark's confession and the kiss we'd shared the night before. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the golden light of dusk spilled through the windows, I found myself in the living room, absently folding a blanket. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner, and I could feel his presence before I saw him. Mark, I said softly, not turning around. Hey, he replied, his voice low, careful. I turned to face him, my hands twisting in the fabric of the blanket. He was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his expression unreadable. He looked younger like this, in his plain t-shirt and jeans, but there was something in his eyes that felt heavier, older. We need to talk, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped into the room, his movement slow and deliberate. Yeah, he said, his tone quiet. We do. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, and I struggled to find the right words. About last night, I began, my voice faltering. That shouldn't have happened. Mark's jaw tightened and he nodded slowly. I know, he said, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, hurt maybe, that made my chest ache. It's not that I don't... I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. It's just complicated. Of course it's complicated, he said, his voice sharper now, but that doesn't mean it wasn't real. His words hit me like a blow, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Mark, we can't. Why not? He interrupted, stepping closer. Why can't we? Because it's wrong, I said, my voice breaking. Because people would never understand, because I'm supposed to be the one who sets boundaries. And what about what we feel? He asked, his tone quieter now, but no less intense. Does that not matter? It matters, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Of course it matters, but it doesn't make it right. Mark closed the distance between us, his hands clenched at his sides. I don't care what anyone else thinks, he said fiercely. I care about you, and I think you care about me too. I looked up at him, my breath catching at the raw vulnerability in his expression. "Mark, just tell me the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you feel the same way, or am I imagining this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was too heavy, too dangerous, and I was terrified of what might happen if I said it out loud. But the silence between us was answer enough. Mark stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence, it was too much. I felt my defenses crumbling, the walls I'd built around myself breaking under the weight of everything I'd been holding back. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't have to," he said, his hands coming up to cradle my face. "Or we'll figure it out together." And then he kissed me. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss was deep, intense, filled with all the things we couldn't say. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt my body melt into his. "Mark," I murmured against his lips, my voice breaking. "I'm here," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "I'm not going anywhere." His hand slid down my arms, his touch slow and deliberate, and I shivered under the intensity of his gaze. He guided me gently backward until my legs hit the edge of the couch, and we sank down together, his weight pressing into me in a way that felt both overwhelming and impossibly right. Time seemed to blur, each moment melting into the next as the world outside faded away. His touch was warm, steady, grounding me even as I felt like I was falling. When it was over, the room was quiet again, the stillness broken only by the sound of our breathing. Mark lay beside me, his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in the crook of my neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw. "For what?" I asked softly, my fingers brushing through his hair. "For making things harder for you," he said. I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. "You didn't," I said. I think I've been making things harder for myself." Mark lifted his head, his gaze searching mine. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But we'll figure it out." The faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips, and he pulled me closer, his arms tightening around me. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, fragile sense of hope, a feeling I thought I'd lost forever. The morning light crept into the living room, painting the walls in soft shades of gold and amber. I woke to the weight of his arm draped across my waist, his breath warm and steady against the back of my neck. For a moment, I let myself stay there, eyes closed, heart full and heavy all at once. But then reality returned, sharp and unrelenting. I shifted gently, slipping out from beneath his arm. The blanket we had pulled over us fell to the side, and I tucked it back around him as he stirred slightly, murmuring my name in his sleep. My chest tightened at the sound, but I forced myself to move away. The kitchen was cool and quiet, the early morning sun streaming through the window above the sink. I busied myself with making coffee, the familiar motions grounding me as my thoughts raced. What had we done? My fingers trembled as I poured water into the coffee maker. I couldn't stop replaying the night before, the way he had looked at me, the way his hands had steadied me when I felt like I might break. For so long, I had felt invisible, like the world had moved on without me. But with Mark, I swallowed hard, setting the pot down on the counter. This wasn't just about me, it was about him, about what this meant for both of us, about the lines we had crossed. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart skip, and I turned to find Mark standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his shirt wrinkled. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, soft, searching, like he was trying to gauge where I stood. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You're up early." I couldn't sleep, I admitted, avoiding his gaze as I reached for a mug. Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he crossed the small distance between us, his hand brushing against mine as he took the mug from me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I hesitated, my throat tightening. "I don't know," I said finally. He nodded, setting the mug down on the counter. "Last night, it was a mistake," I said quickly, cutting him off. The words felt sharp and heavy, and I hated the way his expression faltered at them. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "I don't know what I mean," I said, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. I don't know how to do this, Mark." "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently, stepping closer. But don't pretend it didn't mean something. And I looked at him then, really looked at him, and the raw honesty in his eyes made my breath catch. It did, I admitted, my voice trembling. It did mean something, but that doesn't mean it's not complicated. I know it's complicated, he said, his tone firm. But I'm not scared of that. I need to know if you feel the same way. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I don't know how to answer that, I said softly. Yes, you do, he said, his voice quieter now. You're just scared to say it. He was right. I was terrified of what this meant, of what might happen if I let myself feel what I'd been trying so hard to deny. I don't want to hurt you, I whispered. You're not, he said, his hand brushing against mine. You won't. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence made something inside me crack. I looked at him, my eyes filling with tears, and for a moment I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. Mark, I said softly, my voice trembling, I don't know what happens next. Neither do I, he said, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but yielding. I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of fear and hope. Later that morning, after Mark had left to run errands, I sat by the window with my coffee, staring out at the city. The storm from earlier in the week had left everything washed clean and vibrant, the fire escapes dripping with moisture, the air crisp and fresh. The apartment felt different now, quieter, but not in the way it had before. There was a weight to the silence, a sense of something shifting beneath the surface. I thought about Mark, about the way he had looked at me this morning, the quiet conviction in his voice. He believed we could find a way through this, that what we felt was worth fighting for. And maybe he was right. For so long, I had buried my own needs, my own desires, telling myself they didn't matter. But last night had reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that I was still alive, that I could still feel. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead blurred and treacherous. But as I sat there, the morning sun warming my face, I felt a small, fragile spark of hope. Maybe, for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. Maybe I was finally beginning to live. When Mark returned, his eyes found mine, and in that quiet, unspoken moment, I felt something shift. The story wasn't over.